Ezekiel Langston sat in his old Chevrolet, gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the imposing Delta Airlines headquarters across the parking lot. He had been here before, too many times. The routine was always the same: a firm handshake, a few polite words, and then a rejection wrapped in carefully chosen corporate language. "We appreciate your interest, but at this time, we've decided to go in another direction." He could recite it in his sleep. This time, though, he was here because they had called him. A recruiter had reached out, inviting him for an interview as part of the company's new diversity initiative. Zeke knew what that meant. They wanted him in the room, but they didn't want him in the cockpit. Still, it was a foot in the door, and a foot in the door was all he had ever asked for. He exhaled slowly, glanced at the neatly pressed suit Olivia had insisted he wear, and stepped out of the car. The Georgia sun bore down on him, making the fabric stick to his skin. Inside the building, the air conditioning was sharp and clinical. A receptionist greeted him, her eyes flickering with polite recognition as she gestured toward the waiting area. "Mr. Langston?" A sharply dressed man in his 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a name tag that read Richard Sterling, extended his hand. Zeke knew the name. Sterling was an executive in pilot recruitment, a gatekeeper of sorts. "Mr. Sterling," Zeke replied, shaking the man's hand, keeping his grip firm. They walked together down a long, window-lined hallway that overlooked the runway. Planes were taxiing, their engines humming with the kind of power Zeke had spent his whole life chasing. "You've got quite the record," Sterling said as they entered a sleek conference room. "Air Force veteran, excellent flight hours, good recommendations." He sat down, folding his hands over a thick file that presumably contained Zeke's history. "So tell me, why do you think you haven't been able to secure a position with a commercial airline?" Zeke held his breath for a moment before answering. "You'd have to tell me," he said evenly. "I've done everything right. The experience, the training, the discipline, and yet here I am, still interviewing while pilots with fewer hours than me are already flying." Sterling smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. "Now, Ezekiel, I know there's been conversations about the industry's hiring trends. But let's be honest. Flying commercial isn't just about technical skill. It's about presentation, professionalism, fitting the image passengers expect." Zeke's jaw tightened. He had heard those words before, dressed up in different ways. He forced himself to stay calm. "Are you saying I don't fit the image, Mr. Sterling?" Sterling leaned back, tapping a finger against the table. "I'm saying the airline has to be careful about who it puts in the cockpit. People like familiarity. They trust what they know." Zeke let out a slow breath. He had been prepared for this, but hearing it so plainly still burned. He leaned forward, meeting Sterling's gaze. "People trust skill. They trust experience. I have both." Sterling smirked. "Maybe, but let me be frank with you, Langston. You're here today because of an initiative. We needed to interview a few candidates like you. But a seat in the cockpit? That's earned through more than just hours logged." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Zeke understood the real message. "You'll never fly here. Not because you can't, but because we won't let you." A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he forced himself to nod. He had sat through this song and dance before. "I appreciate your time," he said, standing. Sterling extended a hand. "Best of luck to you." Zeke ignored it. As he walked back to his car, his fists clenched at his sides, the humiliation settled in like a weight on his chest. He had told himself he wouldn't get his hopes up, but some part of him had still believed, just a little, that this time might be different. When he got into the driver's seat, he didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His father's words echoed in his mind, words spoken long ago when Zeke was just a boy dreaming about flying. "They'll try to keep you grounded, son, but the sky belongs to no one." He tightened his grip on the wheel. Maybe Delta didn't want him. Maybe Sterling thought he could dictate where he belonged. But this wasn't over, not even close. Zeke sat across from his sister Olivia in their favorite diner just off Peachtree Street. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, but his appetite was gone. "So that's it?" Olivia asked, stirring her coffee. "They brought you in just to meet some diversity quota?" Zeke rubbed his temples. "That's what it felt like." She let out a sharp breath. "They don't even try to hide it anymore, do they?" Her voice carried the same quiet fury he had been feeling since he left the interview. Doesn't matter. He took a sip of coffee, barely tasting it. I'll find another way. Olivia studied him for a long moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a newspaper. She slid it across the table. Maybe this is the way. Zeke looked down. It was an article about a small up-and-coming airline, Skytrans Aviation, hiring experienced pilots for test flights on a new commercial aircraft. They're offering real opportunities, Olivia said. No quotas. No corporate politics. Just flying. Zeke skimmed the article, skeptical. And why would they take a chance on me? Because you're damn good, she shot back. And because they need talent. He exhaled slowly. Maybe this was what he had been waiting for. A real shot away from the bureaucracy of the major airlines. A week later, he found himself at a private airstrip on the outskirts of Atlanta, shaking hands with Daniel Royce, Skytrans's lead test pilot. Royce was younger than Zeke expected, probably in his early 40s, with a confident, almost cocky demeanor. We've been watching your record, Langston, Royce said. You've got the hours, the skill. We think you might be the right fit. Zeke nodded. I just want to fly. Royce grinned. That's the spirit. The aircraft was a sleek prototype, meant to rival Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. Zeke spent hours familiarizing himself with its controls, every gauge and dial. He felt alive again, as if the rejection from Delta had never happened. The day of the test flight, the sun hung high in a cloudless sky. Zeke strapped in, his hands steady on the controls. Royce sat beside him, running through final checks. All systems look good, Royce said. Let's take her up. Zeke's heart pounded as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. Within seconds, they were airborne, the ground falling away beneath them. Then, without warning, a violent jolt. Alarms blared. The controls locked. The aircraft wasn't responding. Damn it, Royce shouted. We've lost power. Systems aren't engaging. Zeke fought against the stick, every muscle straining. They were losing altitude fast. The aircraft was going down. His training kicked in. Hands moving instinctively, he rerouted power, trying to regain control. The ground rushed toward them. At the last second, the plane lurched back under his command, enough to manage a rough emergency landing on a strip of open field. Smoke filled the cockpit. Royce coughed. Jesus, Langston, you just saved our asses. But even as relief flooded him, a terrible realization crept in. Something wasn't right, because when the emergency team arrived, the first thing they did was confiscate the flight data recorder. And when Zeke looked into Royce's face, he saw it, the flicker of something he hadn't noticed before. Royce already knew. Zeke stood outside the Skytrans hangar, watching as mechanics and engineers scrambled around the damaged aircraft. The emergency landing had caused minimal damage, but the way everyone was acting, you'd think he had crashed straight into a city block. His gut told him something wasn't right. Daniel Royce, the test pilot who had been sitting next to him in that cockpit, had barely spoken a word since they climbed out of the wreckage. That alone was enough to raise a red flag. Now, standing across the tarmac, Royce was deep in conversation with two men in suits, men who did not look like standard company executives. Zeke clenched his jaw. He wasn't a fool. He had spent enough time in the Air Force to know when a story was being rewritten. Someone had already decided how this incident was going to be reported. The only question was, who was going to take the fall? A firm hand clamped onto his shoulder. He turned to see Jim Holloway, one of the senior engineers at Skytrans, a man Zeke had only spoken to in passing. We need you inside, Langston. Holloway's expression was unreadable, but the way he avoided looking Zeke in the eye set off more alarms in his head. Zeke followed him toward the main office, his boots crunching against the gravel. The smell of burned rubber and jet fuel still clung to the air. Inside, he was led into a small, windowless conference room where a Skytrans executive was already seated. Next to him was a lawyer. That was never a good sign. Royce was there too, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. Mr. Langston, the executive began, clasping his hands together. After a thorough review of the incident, we've determined that there was pilot error in the handling of today's test flight. Zeke stared at him. The words hit like a punch to the gut. He barely had time to process before the lawyer leaned in, sliding a folder across the table. In order to avoid further investigation and potential legal action, we're asking you to sign this statement acknowledging full responsibility for the incident. Zeke's eyes flicked down to the folder, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he looked at Royce. You were in that cockpit with me. You know damn well that wasn't pilot error. Royce's jaw tightened, but he still didn't meet Zeke's eyes. Instead, he nodded. The betrayal landed like a weight on Zeke's chest. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Let me get this straight. You're telling me the controls locked up mid-flight. We lost power. I barely managed to save our damn lives, and somehow that's my fault? We have the flight data, the lawyer said smoothly. It supports our conclusion. Zeke let out a bitter laugh. Of course they did. He had seen the flight data recorder being pulled from the wreckage before he even had a chance to breathe. It had never been about finding the truth. It had been about pinning this on someone, and that someone was him. If you sign this, the executive continued, we can handle this quietly. No further action will be taken against you. You walk away, we move forward. Zeke's hands curled into fists beneath the table. And if I don't? The lawyer's expression remained calm, but his words cut sharp. Then we escalate. The FAA will investigate. Your record will be examined, and given the circumstances, you may find it difficult to work in the industry again. There it was, the threat. Zeke exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. This was sabotage. He looked at Royce again. And you damn well know it. For the first time, Royce finally met his gaze. There was something there, regret maybe, but not enough to make him speak up. Zeke stood, pushing the folder away. I'm not signing a damn thing. The lawyer sighed, closing the folder with deliberate patience. The executive, on the other hand, didn't bother hiding his irritation. This is a mistake, Langston, the man warned. For your career, for your future. Zeke turned toward the door. Then I guess we'll see what happens. As he stepped out into the hallway, his heartbeat drumming in his ears, he had the unsettling feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Or maybe, just maybe, he had made the first right move. The next morning, Zeke woke up to a phone call that sent a chill down his spine. Langston, you need to see the news. It was Olivia. Her voice was clipped, urgent. Zeke sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. What's going on? Turn on the damn TV. Still groggy, he reached for the remote and switched on the small television in his apartment. There it was, his face plastered across the screen. A reporter stood outside the Skytrans offices, speaking into the camera with rehearsed precision. New developments in yesterday's test flight incident. According to an internal investigation, the crash was the result of pilot error by former Air Force Captain Ezekiel Langston. Sources say Langston, who was at the controls during the flight, made critical mistakes leading to system failure, an assertion backed by flight data records. Zeke's stomach twisted. They weren't wasting any time. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unknown number. You should have signed. His jaw clenched. He didn't know if it was from Skytrans, from Royce, or from someone higher up. It didn't matter. The message was clear. Zeke? Olivia's voice was still on the line. What the hell is going on? They're setting me up, he muttered, staring at the TV as the segment continued. They're making sure I never work again. Then we fight, she said firmly. We get a lawyer. Zeke shook his head, even though she couldn't see it. No lawyer can fix this. They've already rewritten the story. This is bigger than a lawsuit. There was a long pause. Then quieter, Olivia asked, What are you going to do? Zeke exhaled slowly. His whole life he had played by the rules. He had done everything right. And still, here he was, about to lose everything, not because of what he did, but because of who he was. The Air Force had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to assess, to plan, to strike only when ready. He wasn't going to let them destroy him, not without a fight. I'm going to find out who set this up, he said finally. And when I do, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because for the first time since this all started, he knew exactly what came next. Zeke sat in the corner of a small diner on the outskirts of Atlanta, nursing a black coffee that had long since gone cold. The news had spread like wildfire. His name was already poisoned in the industry, and it had only been 24 hours. He could feel the stares from the other patrons. some curious, some judgmental. He wasn't just another customer anymore. He was the man who had crashed a plane. That's what they were being told, at least. Across from him, Olivia scrolled through her notebook, flipping pages with controlled frustration. This doesn't make sense, she muttered. They went from pilot error to reckless misconduct in less than a day. That's not how investigations work. They're not investigating, Zeke said flatly. They're burying. She glanced up. Then we dig. Zeke ran a hand over his face. He had spent years working to earn respect in an industry that barely tolerated men like him in the cockpit. And now, in less than 24 hours, he had been erased. He looked at Olivia. If we do this, we have to be smart. We need to know exactly who pulled the strings. Olivia nodded. Then we start with the flight data. Zeke exhaled. That was the problem. The only people with access to that were Skytrans and the FAA, and both had already spoken. Or had they? A memory surfaced, something that had seemed insignificant at the time. Jim Holloway, the engineer who had led him into the meeting room after the crash. He had been too careful with his words, like someone who knew more than he could say. I might know someone who can help, Zeke said, already reaching for his phone. Holloway agreed to meet at a secluded auto shop outside the city. When Zeke pulled up, the older man was already there, leaning against his truck, a cigarette between his fingers. I shouldn't be here, Holloway muttered as Zeke stepped out of his car. Then why are you? The engineer sighed, taking a long drag before speaking. Because I don't like watching good men get chewed up by the machine. Zeke crossed his arms. Then tell me what really happened. Holloway glanced around, then lowered his voice. The data from that flight, it was altered. Zeke's pulse quickened. By who? Skytrans, FAA, someone higher. I don't know, but the raw flight data doesn't match what they released. Zeke clenched his jaw. He knew it. Can you get it? He asked. Holloway hesitated. Maybe, but if they catch me, I'll handle the risk, Zeke cut in. Just tell me where it's stored. Holloway took one last drag of his cigarette, then exhaled slowly. FAA archives. The real data is there. Zeke nodded. It was time to go hunting. The FAA regional office in Atlanta wasn't just a building, it was a fortress of bureaucracy. Endless hallways, secured archives, layers of red tape designed to keep the public at arm's length. Zeke parked his car a block away, gripping the steering wheel. Olivia was in the passenger seat, eyes scanning a file filled with every possible legal excuse she could use to get them inside. This is insane, she muttered. You know that, right? Zeke didn't answer, because she was right, but it had to be done. All right, she said, closing the file. We'll go in like we belong. If they ask, we're following up on procedural concerns. You let me do the talking. They stepped out of the car and walked toward the front entrance. Olivia straightened her posture, adjusting the professional blazer she had thrown on last minute. Zeke, dressed in a simple button-up, played the part of the concerned professional, not a man whose career had just been torched. At the front desk, a receptionist barely looked up. Do you have an appointment? Olivia smiled, pulling out a document. We're here for a procedural review regarding the Skytrans flight. Langston case. The woman frowned. I don't see anything about... This was requested internally, Olivia cut in smoothly. We just need access to the incident review files. There was a beat of hesitation. Zeke's stomach nodded. If this didn't work, they would be flagged immediately. But then, the woman exhaled and nodded toward a hallway. Third floor, records department. They walked through without another word. Zeke didn't let himself breathe until they were inside the elevator. You are terrifying, he muttered. Olivia smirked. I know. The records room was quiet, the kind of silence that only government buildings could create. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Olivia scanned the stacks of files. There, Zeke whispered, pointing to a row of cabinets marked Flight Incidents 1960 to present. He pulled open a drawer and started flipping through folders, scanning the labels. Then his fingers stopped. Skytrans flight test, Langston, Ezekiel. He pulled it out, heart pounding. But when he opened the file, his blood ran cold. The flight data was missing. They already pulled it, he muttered. Olivia swore under her breath. It's got to be somewhere. Then they heard footsteps. Zeke shoved the file back into the cabinet just as a voice rang out behind them. "Can I help you too?" A man in a suit stood in the doorway. Not a security guard. Someone higher up. Zeke forced a smile. "We were just finishing up." The man's eyes flickered with suspicion. "That's so." Olivia stepped forward. "We were asked to confirm some details for a procedural review." The man held up a hand. "I know who you are, Mr. Langston." Zeke's stomach dropped. The man smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "And I know why you're here." Zeke's fists clenched at his sides. "You're not going to find what you're looking for," the man continued, "because it doesn't exist anymore." Zeke stared him down, barely able to contain his fury. "Then tell me who made it disappear." The man chuckled. "Walk away, Langston. You're already done." Zeke took a slow breath. He wasn't done. He was just getting started. Zeke sat in the driver's seat of his car, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. The conversation at the FAA office still echoed in his head. "You're not going to find what you're looking for because it doesn't exist anymore." Whoever that man was, he hadn't been bluffing. The flight data that could prove his innocence was gone, scrubbed clean from the system. But Zeke knew one thing. Files didn't just disappear. Someone had taken them. Someone had the power to make them vanish. Olivia sat beside him, flipping through her notebook, her brows furrowed in thought. "We need to figure out who that guy was," she muttered. "I already know," Zeke said, voice tight. "That wasn't just some FAA officer. That was Vernon Hathaway." She snapped her gaze to him. "You're sure?" Zeke nodded. "I never met him when I was in the Air Force, but I know his name. He's been pulling strings in the industry for years." He exhaled sharply. "If he's involved, this isn't just about Skytrans. This is bigger." Olivia's expression darkened. "Then we're up against more than just a corporation." Zeke nodded. "We're up against an entire system." Hathaway wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was the gatekeeper of the aviation industry. He had the power to decide who got to fly and who never set foot in a cockpit again. And now Zeke knew for certain that Hathaway had orchestrated the cover-up. But knowing wasn't enough. He needed proof, and proof meant taking risks. Zeke called Nate Calloway, the journalist from Atlanta Journal, who had been sniffing around aviation corruption for years. "You better have something good," Nate said when they met later that evening in a dimly lit bar downtown. Zeke slid a napkin across the table, scribbled with one name, Hathaway. Nate whistled low. "You sure?" "I don't have the flight data, but I have something better. His involvement." Nate leaned in, intrigued. "If we can tie Hathaway to the missing flight data, we can blow this open." Zeke nodded. "We don't just expose him, we force him to come after us." Nate grinned. "Now you're thinking like a journalist." The next morning, the headline in Atlanta Journal sent shockwaves through the industry. "Vernon Hathaway, the man who controls the skies?" It was an expose on his unchecked power, his long history of influencing aviation policies, and a not-so-subtle hint that his name was tied to the recent Skytrans incident. Zeke had expected retaliation, but he hadn't expected it to come so fast. His phone buzzed, a blocked number. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Click. Zeke exhaled slowly, then turned to Olivia. "We just forced his hand," he said. "Now we see how he plays it." Zeke wasn't naive. He knew Hathaway wasn't going to just threaten him. He was going to destroy him. And it didn't take long. Within hours, news stations began airing a new report on Zeke. Langston's history under scrutiny, sources revealed potential misconduct in his Air Force record. It was all lies, fabricated to make him look unreliable. Hathaway wasn't just burying him, he was burning everything down. Olivia stormed into Zeke's apartment, throwing a stack of papers on the table. "They're trying to erase you," she said. Zeke didn't flinch. "Then we fight back." Hathaway's next move was even more ruthless. FBI agents arrived at Zeke's door. "You're under investigation for leaking classified flight data," the lead agent announced. Zeke stared at him, pulse pounding. "You have to be kidding me." But they weren't. Hathaway had made it official. As Zeke was taken in for questioning, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about his career anymore. This was a war. Zeke sat across from his interrogator, hands clasped together. "You have nothing on me," he said coolly. The agent smirked. We don't need to. We just need to keep you occupied. Zeke's mind raced. Hathaway wasn't trying to convict him. He was stalling. He was buying time. Then his phone rang. Olivia. We found someone, she whispered. A former FAA officer. He has the real flight data. Zeke exhaled. This is it. The problem? Their new witness was scared. If I testify, I'm dead, he told Zeke. Then we protect you, Zeke said. But you have to trust us. The man hesitated. Then finally, a nod. Zeke turned to Olivia. We take this to Washington. They never made it to Washington. On the way to the airport, they were ambushed. A black SUV cut them off. Gunshots rang out. Zeke grabbed the witness and ducked for cover. Hathaway had officially gone off the rails. Olivia shouted, We have to move, now! Zeke clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about exposing Hathaway anymore. This was survival. Hathaway made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the power of the truth. Zeke and Olivia got the witness on live television, broadcasting his confession before Hathaway could silence him. Within hours, Hathaway was under federal investigation. By morning, he was arrested. And just like that, the most powerful man in aviation fell. Months later, Zeke sat in the cockpit of a commercial jet, gripping the controls. The intercom clicked on. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard. He had won, not just for himself, but for every pilot who had been told no just because of who they were. The sky belonged to no one, and now, finally, he was flying. They took his wings. They buried his career. They thought they could erase him. But Ezekiel Langston isn't done. When a routine test flight turns into a deadly setup, Zeke finds himself in the fight of his life, against a system built to keep men like him out. Lies, corruption, power plays at the highest level. The truth is out there, but getting to it? That might cost him everything. How do you take down the man who controls the skies? Strap in, because this story is about to take off. They tried to silence him. They tried to erase him. But in the end, the truth couldn't be buried forever. Ezekiel Langston's fight wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about breaking a system designed to keep him grounded. His story is a reminder that power is only as strong as the fear it creates. And when fear is replaced with courage, even the most untouchable giants can fall. But here's the real question. How many more stories like this are still hidden? How many voices have been silenced before they ever had a chance to be heard? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you want more stories that challenge the system, hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because this is just the beginning.